Most Haunted. Years and years and years ago, I worked for a TV show called Most Haunted that some of you may have seen. They hired me as a researcher, and I spent a couple of happy seasons off stage, occasionally on stage. Every time I appear as something different. Sometimes I'm an expert, sometimes I'm a historian, and sometimes I'm a parapsychologist. But I often used to stop and think, Most Haunted, what a meaningless term. How do we measure how haunted somewhere is? I'm sure that some of you in the audience tonight are living in houses that, by some measure, are haunted. But how do we tell if your home is more haunted than yours? How does one decide that somewhere is the most haunted house in England? Okay, 1985. I was a young schoolboy, 16 years old, doing my A-levels in Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk. And my brother-in-law said to me, "Have you read The Most Haunted House in England?" And I said, "No, what a load of tosh." And he said, "It's just down the road." And I said, "Yeah, Ross, isn't it? I don't believe in ghosts." Because I didn't, because I was a 16-year-old and I knew better. My parents believed in ghosts. I didn't. That all changed a couple of years later when I actually had a really uncanny experience that led me to become deeply fascinated by the whole idea of the supernatural. But for the moment, let's stay with me at 16, doing my A-level history project and browsing through Bury Archive, where we found a series of books relating to Borley Rectory, one of which I've just discussed with Steve Parsons, because it did look to us like it could have been a version of the infamous missing locked book. But it didn't matter. I found the works of Harry Price, and I flipped through them and I thought, what a load of tosh. Haunted Rectory. But I had the presence of mind to talk to my grandmother about it. Now, old Alice Bentley, she grew up in Bury St Edmunds. Anyone here from Suffolk or ever been to Suffolk? Yeah, well, Borley's a strange place. I mean, the thing about Borley is it's hard now because we all know it through the ghosts. But if you grew up near there, it's basically the arse end of nowhere. Yeah? You drive from Bury St Edmunds south down the A134 towards towns like Lavenham, but you actually get to Long Melford. Now, Long Melford has no reason to exist apart from antique shops. When I was growing up, they had 68 antique shops, but they didn't have a fish and chip shop. What is wrong with a town that has 68 antique shops and does not have a fish and chip shop? Anyway, Long Melford, just as you come into Long Melford, which has got a magnificent walled church. It's got a huge graveyard, but the church is like a cathedral. It dominates the whole village. There's Kentwell Hall at one end, which is an Elizabethan manor, which is, again, very beautiful. You come down the hill and there's the turning to Foxearth. Why would anyone ever go to Foxearth? I don't know. If you take that road, it's a country road that winds along the edge of the River Stour, on the border between Suffolk and Essex. I think in 1975, a whole chunk changed there. But between the two counties, if you go south of that river, then fate and style requires you to wear high heels, white high heels, and appear on, what do they call it, the only way is Essex? If you live north of that, then you'd be a right one of them there yokels, boy, from that there Suffolk, you know. I can't read and I can't ride, but I can't off-drive a tractor. And go down Bury Market for a bit of that there pig sticking, you know, boy. So, you know, that was the stereotype of where I grew up. And if you drive along that road, that border road between Essex and Suffolk, you encounter vast swathes of nothing. Now, Kate Bush actually grew up out there amongst those sunken lanes on that border territory, but really, there's windswept hedges, ash breaks, occasional small woods called coppices anywhere else, but coppies in Suffolk. And it's a lonely territory. It's a chalk area just on the edge of the clay before you head up into the fens. So it's not even interesting geologically. You ride up that hill, and at the top of it, there's a small church. Suffolk's got 300 churches. 300 church parishes built in the Middle Ages. They used to call it Silly Suffolk, from the Anglo-Saxon word selig, meaning holy. Well, that's what I'm told. Actually, I suspect it's because Suffolk people are a bit silly and soft in the head, like me. But you come to a church, which is really common. And then there's church house, a barn, a sizable farmhouse, a couple of small bungalows and some scraggy wood. You drive around the corner, and the next sign says Borley Green. You've driven past about 5 houses, and then you realise Oh, that was the village of Borley. Really? Village? More of a hamlet, surely. How many of you have been there? Did you get that impression that you can almost blink and you miss it? It is absolutely tiny. 1985. Some of my friends were out there and living in the area. They were actually just down the road, a couple of villages down, where the Bulls built something really strange, but that's another story. I'll get to that in a minute if I remember. But down there, the police turned up. We were out driving. I can't remember why, apart from the fact we were 16 years old and some of our friends had bought cars. Oh yeah, the Sisters of Mercy, the Cult, the Mission. We were goths, that's right. Does anyone remember goth? We used to drive around with our goth music blaring and drive out and meet up with other, groups of delinquent teenagers from Suffolk in graveyards and sit around and chat. And we'd go to the Christopher in Sudbury and we'd drink at the Bull in Long Melford and we'd drive back down to Bury. So that's what you do when you're a teenager out there. There's not much else to do. According to Ed Sheeran, what's his name? Not Ed Sheeran. Is it Ed Sheeran? The ginger-haired guy with the guitar. He grew out there at Framlingham and he claims he drove around the country roads at 90 miles an hour. If you did that, you'd end up dead. But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, out there in the darkness is a village that you can almost miss. So I went back to my grandmother and I said, this here Borley, we were driving past it tonight and it was full of police officers. And she said, that'll be the ghosts. Why would you send lots of police officers out there? Because when I were a girl, they said it was haunted, the rectory there that burnt down in an insurance job. Oh yeah, it's fairly famous, Nan. That's right, and because of that, lots of idiots drive up there from London almost every night and cause trouble. So every year at Halloween, at the village of Borley, they have roadblocks to make sure that no troublemakers get into the village. And to this day, access at night, there's a couple of cameras which go directly down to Sudbury control room at the police station, which seems like an incredibly strange usage of police resources. But if you live in a small, extremely wealthy and prosperous hamlet with a few houses and bungalows, the last thing you probably want is lots of teenagers running around screaming and breaking around your garden at night. So one of the things I'm going to start off by stressing as a Suffolk local is do go to Borley, do visit, be respectful, don't be those idiots. Be careful and don't cause trouble. And if you're asked to move on by the locals, just, shrug and say thank you. Or a chap we know who came from Bury said it was all right as long as we were nice, or something like that, Or fancy a drink down the Bull, something to suggest you might be local. Or you could try and imitate my terrible accent. Borley today, unfortunately, has very little to see apart from the church. The church became incredibly famous in the 1970s. Did anyone, I don't suppose any of you grew up with Anglia TV, did you? Maybe some of the people in our audience did. But yeah, Anglia TV in the 70s sent a newspaper sent a investigative team from Look East. And Look East was a kind of tea time magazine show that was on after the news. And they sent them down there. I think there's a Look West or a Bristol equivalent. I can't remember what it's called. But they sent them down there and they went into the church and they took in their equipment and they set it up. And they sat around and smoked a few cigarettes. And then they started to get a bit cold and it was a bit dark. And then something coughed outside. They said it was probably a badger or a fox. So they went out into the churchyard. And then it was even colder. And about midnight, they gave up on their vigil and they went and sat in the van. But they left the tape recorders running. And if you can find it, and I'm sure it's on YouTube, you actually hear the door go, and you hear thumping, and there's various creaking and groaning noises throughout the night, and strange things that they recorded in the church. And actually, now that the rectory has been gone for this 70 odd years, the church is where a lot of the ghost hunting activity is. And I'm sure many of you have heard the story of the secret passage. No? In the 1970s, the East Anglian Psychic Research Group of the time, early 70s, about 73, claims that the tomb, there's a Victorian tomb just outside the door, near the side door of the church. And I'm going from memory here, so you'll have to forgive me if you get there and fall over it in the dark. It's a low tomb with an iron railing around it, and it's got a kind of pointy top and a large stone slab. And they claimed that they realised that it was a false burial. There's no burial record of it. So they opened it up and they found that there's a staircase that goes down and enters a hidden crypt, which is under Borley Church. And Ed Babbs, who was married to the widow of the last vicar of Borley, because now the parish of Borley, Foxearth and Liston have been combined and the seat is at Liston, he claims to know more about it and that photographs had been taken. And I have many, many, many times thought, well, why doesn't Church House just send an archaeologist down to have a look? Because there appeared to be signs that people had been using an underground chapel beneath the church until relatively recently. And there was one aspect of it that really caught my attention. They said that when they looked through the door, there were lead coffins in niches around. Now, lead was used in some Suffolk burials, but the coffins were moved up. Some of them were on their ends and others were, scattered, and they therefore did not enter the room. But there was a sign on the door that said Harry Bull had 1928 or something like that. It's in Ed Babb's book on Borley. I'm not inventing this. You can go and look up his account of what he was told by the East Anglian Psychic Research Group from the 70s. And his book, Edward Babb's book, he was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, and I had the privilege of knowing him in the 90s. It's an excellent read. And unlike almost everything that's been written on Borley, it's written by somebody who actually lived in Suffolk and knew the place. So I said to my gran, anyway, to go back to my dear old Nan, so Alice, did you ever go out to the rectory? Oh yes, all the time. I used to be out there with the codswallop, she said. The what? The codswallop. We all know the word codswallop. Apparently, according to her, codswallop was a lemonade brand. Cod was a Bury St Edmunds-based manufacturer of lemonade from round about 1880s through to about just after the First World War. And in the years after the First World War, she used to go out on a pony trap and drive out to Borley Rectory and deliver lemonade to the house, to the Ball sisters. And I said to her, what was it like? And she said, big, dark, smelt bad. What? It smelt really bad. They had bad drains. And I thought, well, I've never read that in any book on Borley Rectory. And she said, well, it's impossible to heat. It was damp and it smelt bad and they had rotten drains. And but I never saw any ghosts. I don't believe in them. And that was it. That was all she told me. What a letdown. You discover your grandmother delivered lemonade to Borley Rectory and the best she can tell you is it had bad drains. I asked my mum and she told a story about seeing across the field further back towards Belchamps a strange brown mass moving across the field that smelt, her and her friend Joyce, she said it smelt sweet and sickly, and they watched it wondering what it was. Now, she'd know a sandblow if she saw one, she's a Suffolk girl, but she said it looked like a brown cloud, and it came from the direction of Borley Parish over towards, and she said, and me and Joyce looked at one another, and we sat there wondering what it was, and then it turned and moved towards us, and she said, we got on our bikes and we rode like hell. So that was my mother's deeply uninteresting ghost story. Anyway, a while later, I did actually see a ghost of my own, and that got me interested enough to actually do some research. This is 1987 by now. I'm still a bit of a goth, but you'll have to, add the soundtrack in your mind. And I had a ghostly experience over in Thetford at the Priory with 4 other friends, which we talked about on Ghost Hunters back in the 90s. I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary, but I'm not going to tell the story tonight. That led me to go back to the archive and try and find those books I'd seen. And there I found a whole host of papers about Borley. Some really positive and some totally cynical. But I very quickly became bored with the case because people like Steve find it fascinating and can spend forever rehashing Harry Price's notes. I was interested in things like the tunnel that's just been discovered across the road. Have any of you heard about that? Outside where the house was, near the bottom of the Nuns' Walk, there is actually a subterranean tunnel that's been found by ground penetrating radar in the late 90s or early 2000s. And I found this not from the Society for Psychical Research, not from ASAP, not from any of the ghost hunting groups. I found this from Suffolk Highways. I'm guessing it's a culvert because I can see no sane reason why anyone would want to build tunnels under that section of road. But I have actually seen some tunnels up there. And the bulls are stranger than one can imagine. They moved away from the parish, but they built the Bull's Folly. I think it's down near Liston. It's in the woods. What it actually is you go into the woods and there's this brick tower. I guess it's about 50 foot high. And it's got a spiral staircase that goes up inside. And at the top, the roof is open, but there's astrological symbols painted on the walls. And it's got a window, or that they may have been painted by somebody later, of course. But the same Harry Bull, who famously, was at Borley, also built this really peculiar brick tower in the woods. And when we were kids, we used to like to go down there and try and climb it. Apparently, it's really unsafe now. So, if you're interested in this kind of thing, grab an OS map or Google Maps and look up Tower plus Bull. Let's move on to another bull. In memory of my dear friend John Bull, who passed away last summer. He was out at the church house Stanton. John, I was at school with him. We grew up together, and he died of a heart failure earlier this year. Late last year. But his childhood home, Church House Stanton, is where he's just been interred. And when we were after the funeral, when we went to find his grandmother's and grandfather's grave where he was being buried by his childhood home, we walked round Church House, and it hit me that I'd heard the name before. And then I remembered where, Gentleman's Quarterly, I think it's about 1750. Have any of you heard the story of the moving coffins of Barbados? Right, yeah, well, if you know the story, basically the Chase family vault in Barbados had a series of lead coffins, and every time they opened the tomb, the coffins had moved of their own volition and were jumbled about. And the only explanation I've ever seen was Joe Nichol, the great skeptic, suggested that it was actually possibly a coded analogy for a Freemasonic rite, and there never were any moving coffins. But if you look in Gentleman's Quarterly, you can discover that there was a version of the same story in Stanton. And although I can't remember the exact date, all of you probably have Google on your phone. So if you look up Stanton, Suffolk moving coffins, by the wonders of technology, you'll be able to read the whole story by the time I've got safely home tonight and had my tea. So, but yeah, now the reason I remembered that was not just the fact we were burying a bull, but the fact that the lead coffins being jumbled up at Stanton reminded me of the description of the lead coffins under Borley. So maybe what we should do is not just worry about Borley Rectory, the most haunted house, and Harry Price and Robert Woods and all of the others Tabori and all of the others have written so many words about it. Maybe what we should do is drive out there at night and look at some of the other landscapes of Suffolk and try and get a sense of the context of the overall haunting. 1919. The First World War had ended, and two young brothers who were back from the trenches had been at a play at the Theatre Royal in Bury St Edmunds. They got on their motorbikes and they were driving out towards Hall Farm, which is at Bradfield St George, so out in the direction of Borley, down the 134, going south towards Sudbury. And as they were motoring along, they suddenly saw a mysterious glow on the horizon. It looked like, they said, a great fire, a great orange light. And they assumed, logically, that a barn was on fire. So in those days, a barn fire was a terrible tragedy because if you lost your food, the whole community could suffer. They rode home to the farm because they decided that when they got to the farm, what they needed to do was grab some water and then go and find whatever the farm was that was on fire. Now, it wasn't a sunset because this is the middle of the night. So they go out to look for this red, orangey coloured burning barn they think they can see in the distance. And as they drive up, the dog's barking violently. It seems to be scared. And they get off their bike, and then they see what I still regard as one of the most peculiar and frightening phenomena I've ever heard of. From their own living room, where the dog has fled, and where the house is empty, but locked, there's an incredibly bright white light. A brilliance so bright they cannot look upon it. and they shielded their eyes, and they said that it was incomparably brighter than the arc lights, the electric arc lights at Bury Football Club, which were probably the brightest lights you'd see in those days. So they made their way round, and they climbed up, and finally they moved around to see if it was a reflection, but no, it seemed to be whatever it was inside their house. So this is two really strange luminous phenomena that night within a few minutes of one another. The dog runs away in terror. They throw open the door, go in, and the light, if it had been a reflection, it would have done what they said, it would have lit up the window, but it lit the whole barnyard. So the light was the source, it was an actual light source that was spreading out. When they enter, there's just darkness. They went out on their bikes, they drove all over the countryside, they roused the police. No one could find a burning barn. Geologically, it's chalk, it's boulder clay. There's nothing there to cause earth lights, there's nothing there to cause this kind of luminous phenomena. This is 1919, it's not a UFO, we don't have a concept of that then. It's just a really weird, anomalous experience, and it happens maybe 10 miles from Borley. And I was reminded then that Borley Rectory at night, they used to say that the windows shone with a strange light. And I also remembered, do many of you know the story of Maria Martin and the Red Barn? If you're ever in Bury St Edmunds, Maria Martin was a dashing young maiden who was murdered by her lover, William Corder, who was a wicked squire, in 1805, I believe. It might be in 1815. I've written a really detailed account of it on the web. My blog is And Sometimes He's So Nameless. If you just go there, there's loads of stuff about Borley, Harry Price, all of the stuff I'm talking about. But so popular was the murder trial that Corder's depiction, he used to wear a top hat and had a little moustache that he would twiddle the ends of. It gave rise to an entire genre of Victorian melodrama about squires kidnapping wholesome young maidens. A bit later, they used to tie them to railway lines, but they couldn't, obviously, in 1815 because we hadn't quite invented the railway. But yeah, William Corder was executed, and the place where he killed Maria Martin is called the Red Barn. And the reason it's called the Red Barn is apparently that the sun setting in the west on the horizon from the village used to cause it to appear to be bathed in blood at night. As the sun went down behind, the light would come through the chinks and it would make it appear to be dripping blood. And burning barns or red barns are in Suffolk folklore a symbol of evil. Again, all probably unrelated, but this idea of a shining building, Borley shining. Actually, it was very unfortunate for one young man. He was an Austrian fellow who, in the late 30s, bought a whole load of land around Suffolk. They made a Sky documentary about it a few years ago. And what he did was he built these huge barns that were absolutely useless as barns, but wonderful if you wanted aircraft hangars. And then he concreted nice large barnyards. I actually grew up on one of his old farms, Lodge Farm. And as soon as the war started, he was arrested and picked up. And he couldn't understand what he'd done that had attracted the attention so readily of the police, and that for them to realise that he was actually... The idea was, it was a putative German plan to be able to land paratroopers, etc., and actually have forwards, East Anglian air bases if they needed them. I didn't believe any of this was true, but as I said, Sky One managed to find the records in the archive. Just Google Red Barns, Nazi plot, Suffolk, something like that, airfield, you'll find it. But he painted his barns red. And because red barns are such a cursed and unlucky colour, everybody talked about them. Oh, why has he built a bloody red barn then? Well, he's a bit daft, isn't he? He's Austrian. Well, why has he built a bloody red barn though? It's bad luck. Actually, why has he built a red barn? Especially one big enough to hold a whole bunch of aeroplanes, but not big enough. He's not actually growing any crops. Oh, did you say he's Austrian? Isn't that Mr. Hitler Austrian? Oh, yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. Suffolk folklore. Borley had its own legend of a nun. We all know the story? The story was that the nearby monastic house at Bures, B-U-R-E-S, had a nun and a monk who fell in love with one another and eloped, and they were caught. I think some say that she was from Clare, which is where the convent was. Others say that the convent was at Borley. But they were caught at Borley, dragged from their coach, and beheaded. He was beheaded, and she was walled up for her sins. And I have spent some time going through the manorial histories of Suffolk manors, because I'm really boring, trying to find any kind of ecclesiastical endowment in Borley, and I never have, but I did find that the Waldegraves who were there and who owned it were, of course, famous Catholic sympathisers during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. So it's entirely possible that there could have been nuns called Marie there. But anyway, we get the idea, don't we? So I was a goth, I grew up in Suffolk, I've got really weird parents who tell strange stories, and I was a bit cynical about Borley Rectory. But the point is, contextually, all of this stuff comes together. And you start to think, well, can you take any of it without the rest? Why are we privileging this story over Hall Farm and the Strange Light or the Burning Barn? Or my favourite ghost story of all, and we said we'd talk about other hauntings, and I've got 20 minutes, so I'm going to do just that. We're going to go back to my grandmother's son, my mother's brother, my uncle, in fact, Ted. Uncle Ted was a stout man. To be fair, he would make me look diminutive. He was 55 stone. So he was nearly 3 times, in fact, he was 3 times my body weight. And he was massive. And he was also of that generation who wore their trousers, their waistband just below their nipples. And he always used to wear big green Trek trousers. He was a wonderful man, but my father had to make him reinforced iron chairs to sit upon. Anyway, Uncle Ted, happily married. He lived to be, they kept telling him, Ted, you'll lose weight, you'll lose weight. If you don't, he worked in the mortuary. And they said, if you don't lose weight, you're going to be next here, you're going to die. He lived till he was 88. He slimmed down, he lost 30 stone, went out in the ice with a dog, Jumble. Dog was pulling at something, a cat or something, slipped on the ice, fell over and hit his head. And his wife said, if he hadn't lost all that weight, there's no way he could have hit his head, is there? Very sad story. But anyway, my Uncle Ted, when he was a schoolboy, 14 years old, before he joined the Fleet Air Arm and served in the war, he was out delivering for Auburn Davis. And I was surprised the other day, I was in Suffolk, and I discovered that Broughton's, which is part of Auburn Davis, that chain still exists. And what they used to do before the war, the Second War, was they used to go out and they would have a catalogue, because at harvest time each year, the local labourers would be given a harvest bonus, which would be a significant sum of money. And the harvest bonus might be, I don't know, a quarter of their annual pay. And at that time, it was traditional for them to buy new clothes to last them for the winter. So the local gentlemen's outfitters, Broughton's, Davis, etc., they knew this, so they used to go round all the farms and all the farm cottages and take their catalogues, which were the internet of the day. The mail order catalogue really did revolutionise shopping for most people in that period. So, he was 14 years old. The old man, Auburn Davis, he used to drive out in his car, which was, I think he said it was a Rolls Royce, but to be honest, I think, any car was a Rolls Royce when you grew up like he did, with a bike, and that was it. He drove out, and he was in the back of the car with a stack of them, and they'd drive up to the cottages, and he'd jump out, he'd run up and put them through the door, and they were driving down the road between Rougham, Rough, A-M, Rougham, and Bradfield St George. Very easy places to find on a map. I should have brought one. And suddenly, he saw this great big house, and he said it was Queen Anne style, so it had kind of dormer windows, which are windows set into the roof, and it had beautiful flowers. Beautiful flowers it had. You're right, boy? They're Suffolk, that proper beautiful. Had all these beautiful flower beds, and he said it had a gravel drive and a yellow wall and gates. And he shouted out to the old man, "You've missed one, you missed a house." And the old man looked over his shoulder and said something like, "Bugger it!" And he put his foot down. He started to reverse or turn the car. And as they did, he said there was a sudden rush of wind and the house had gone. Well, it's a classic tall story, isn't it? Everywhere else in the world, people have got ghosts that haunt houses, not in Suffolk. Our ghosts are houses. So, I thought, well, but I heard the story when I was a boy, and it was stories like that which led me to believe that ghosts were a load of rubbish. But I asked him about it years later when I got interested in ghosts, and he said, oh yeah, absolutely true, absolutely, completely true. That happened to me, and it happened to other people as well. And then Audrey, my mother, bless her, she's still going, she's a good old girl, she said, a friend of mine at work, she saw that house that Uncle Ted saw. She calls it the Fairy Cottage. What? Well, Mum worked at the West Suffolk Hospital, where she was a hospital hygienist, kitchen cleaning, looking after things. This is a woman who, if she ever found a rat in the washing up, would give it a good rinse before she put it in the garden. But anyway, no, I'm joking. She's not quite that bad. But when we lived on a farm, I shudder. But she's a great woman. And she used to have a friend at work who insisted that sometimes when she was driving to work, she'd come down the hill and there'd be a small cottage on a wood on the left-hand side. And this cottage had a yellow wall. So I said, well, that's not the same house, is it? It's nothing like the description from Uncle Ted. And then I found it. It's in, I'm not going to look it up exactly. It's on my blog if you just look up The Disappearing House. But in the 1970s, before I was very old, about 75, when I was about 6, a gardening magazine carried a story by a Mr. Cobbold, who'd been out with his butcher's pony trap, delivering down Kingshall Street between Rougham and Bradfield St George, when he had experienced on a summer's day a whoosh, and suddenly there'd been this big house where there had previously been no house, and the pony trap took off, and he was thrown, but he got a good look at the house, and they looked at it and they saw it. And so we started to collect stories. And we found not one or two, but over 20 different accounts. And I thought, folklore, isn't it? It's got to be. But then I realised something really, really interesting about these accounts. Do you remember the story, the difference between the first two I heard? Most of the people see from Kingshall Street a great big house that's standing by the road, set back with lawns, Queen Anne Mansion. But my mother's friend and some of the others had seen a small cottage. And then I realised what they're actually seeing is the gatekeeper's cottage at the back of the property. And then I came across the final bit that really which really got me interested. Haunted Houses by, what's his name? Bennett. Bennett was, I believe, a High Court judge, but I could be wrong, who in 1936 did a broadcast for the BBC where he appealed for information on people's ghost stories. And two women, a Mrs. Wynne and a Mrs. Allison, who had travelled to Bury St Edmunds and had been staying out at the village at Rougham or Bradfield, had gone out for a walk one day, and they had responded in 36 with their account of the house. Now, the gardening version had actually occurred in the 1880s or 1890s, so we now had stories that dated from around about 1880, 1890, right the way through to 1970, of the same apparition, a house. I don't know about you and me, but finding a phantom nun seems positively difficult compared with catching a phantom house. It's either there or not there. I mean, we could shove a webcam up to watch for it. We could fire a drone overhead. We could, there's just so many ways you could keep an eye on what's going on. Furthermore, it seems to make some kind of geographical sense. Once you work out the roads, you can work out roughly where it should be. If the cottage they saw was at the back and the main house is at the front. So we went out to the field and we thought, okay, we'll go and have a look for this. And it was me, Dave the Munchkin, Marcus Holland, a bunch of my friends. We drove out there and we parked up and we walked across the field. And it's much the same as the field around Borley. If you ever want a bit of Borley brick, I've got a bit. You can drive out to the field behind the house, and where the rubble from the house has slowly been ploughed in, there's all kinds of bits of pan tile and brick, etc. I should sell them on the internet, really, shouldn't I? Genuine brick from Borley. Get one here, £5, 500. I don't know what you could charge. But yeah, there seems to be debris, but that doesn't prove anything because there's all kinds of debris. By this time, I found out that Tony Cornell at the Society for Psychical Research, a very distinguished investigator, had spent years going through the maps trying to locate the house. And he'd traced it back to 1815, and there was certainly no house on the site after the 1815 New Military Road, as it's called, was placed down Kingshall Street. We found an earlier map from the 1730s that shows a family coat of arms and shows a house near the site. The problem is that 18th century maps are basically cartoons. People just draw a "here be dragons," or the house is sort of vaguely there, and maybe they drew it on the right side of the road and maybe they didn't. But anyway, so we walked around. It was a hot day, because it always seems to appear in the middle of August. It was boiling hot, 1988 or 9, walking around the field. And then we came to a coppice, a wood. And it's a narrow, long wood between two fields. And we'd walked basically down the side of the field, and we'd come back down, and we thought, well, we might as well walk down here rather than try and walk diagonally across the farmer's field. So we're walking through the wood, and then I had one of those revelation moments when you just want to jump up and down and shout "Eureka!" Because I suddenly noticed that we were walking down the middle of the wood, and it was sunken. On either side, it was higher. So it was kind of a ditch, if you like, a dip in the middle of the wood. And then I saw that on either side, there were trees that were massive, but nearly all the rest of the trees in the middle were really small. And I finally worked it out. We were walking down an avenue of trees with a wall on either side behind the trees, or in front of the trees. I can't remember which way around it was. It was in front of the trees. There had been a brick wall on either side, and those brick walls are still there today. If you scrape the soil away, you can find the yellow bricks that were described in the ghost story. You can see the avenue that led up to the house, and you can see these mighty trees that were built. There's no reason to plant trees on either side of a road unless it leads somewhere. And this obviously had led to a house. But since that time, trees had grown and infilled the area. So you can go there. It's the corner. It was where Kingshall Street between Bradfield, St George and Rougham takes a sharp turn. And you can walk along there and you can survey the area and see that there are the remains of ancient fish ponds. And the fish ponds were part of the description of the house as well. But you can actually see where there are ponds still that are long since overgrown. No sign of a house. No sign of a house in the records. I cannot work out. If I had a name, I could trace it through the West Suffolk archives easily. But without knowing what the house ever was, yet no story, no local story of a house that burnt down, no story of a house ever being there. No one locally seems to know anything of such a building, and we've tried asking the local historians, and they're not stupid. So whatever led to the destruction of this building that I'm convinced stood there, for some reason, it caused it to be erased from history, forgotten. But not quite forgotten, because every few years, some poor sod driving down that road feels a sudden whoosh of cold air, and there's the building, standing as real as any other. And the strange thing about it, if you saw it, who would run into it? Yeah, that's my thought was it's like a TARDIS, isn't it? It might be a bit Brigadoon. You might come back and find it's the 2040s. Pop music may be better. Hey, you'd be younger. Well, in comparison with the rest of your friends, they'd all be a lot older. But the really weird bit about it is, if I'm correct, and apparitions are largely constructed internally, which doesn't mean they're not real, but I think that they're generated by the process of the mind. This seems to put the lie to that, because it is a physical object, because it's displacing air. It's like somebody's dropping a house there, and as they drop the house into the space, the air is displaced. And it is an air displacement effect that is common to all these stories written by different people over 70 or 80 years. And while some of them just don't fit and just sound like they were made up, and there are a couple, the majority of them, I'd say 85, 90%, seem to agree in detail. The stories are not well known. I grew up out there without ever hearing them. Yet, a bit of poking around and you'll soon find them. So, ladies and gentlemen, I challenge you. You could go to Borley. You could hang around at night hunting ghosts and trying to find out if it really was the most haunted house in England. Or you could drive 5 miles down the road to Rougham take a picnic with you, explore the archaeological remains of the house I've described, and see if you can actually see it, and see if you can work out the secret. You can go to Rangett Street Archive in Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk, and you can find the original documents relating to Borley. You could go to Long Melford and go down to the Bull and talk to people there, and they will tell you it's a load of rubbish in it. Oh, I never heard it. Never seen any ghost in my time. But they said that in the 1930s. And do you know what? In 1931, there were so many people turning up in motor cars from London to look at Borley that the police closed the road. 1931. 54 years later, they reinstituted it. If you want to know more about it, West Suffolk Police are pretty good people. You want the Sudbury station, they will talk to you. They are friendly. Generally speaking, as long as you've got a bit of time, you're fairly sensible, the locals don't bite. But when we talked about should we do an event about Borley near there, I said, I don't want to get shot. So please, show respect to the locals. I am a Suffolk lad. I've tried to put Borley in the context of a teenager who grew up surrounded by these stories, surrounded by the history of psychical researchers, many of whom I've known people who knew many of them. I still do, Mary Rose Barrington and others who actually knew some of the people we've mentioned tonight. And me and Steve can talk for hours about their peccadillos and their faults and their failings. But there's more to Suffolk and there's more to ghosts than Borley. And I would encourage all of you to go out there, find your own case, and do something far more interesting than rehashing Price's legacy. Create something new. So, any questions?
What was your blog called?
And sometimes he's so nameless. It's a line from Jefferson Airplane's song, Lava. It's my favourite song. So, and sometimes he's so nameless. I think we've got some more time, so I hope somebody will come up with a question. Has anyone actually been to Borley then? Would anyone like to tell us about their experiences at Borley?
Well, we went about 20 years ago. Yes, we went about 20 years or so ago, and it was in the height of the summer. We had a little look round the churchyard and what have you, but didn't experience anything abnormal or what have you. But you were right about the area. It is definitely a very strange little place in the middle of nowhere. And we didn't go in the antique shops.
Oh, you didn't go in the antique shops? Long Melford and Lavenham are filled with antique shops. They're great places. If you go down to Long Melford, the Bull has a story, I think it's 1578. There was a murder there. Two men got drunk and they were fighting, and one of them ran the other one through with a rapier several times, and he fell stone dead. And what they did was they laid him out for the inquest that was called. And I don't know if you're aware, but in medieval and onwards through early modern England, it was a really bad idea to have a body turn up in your parish. Because if the murderer wasn't actually found, then the burial costs would be inflicted upon the parish. They would end up paying for it. So people had a bit of a grudge against dead bodies turning up. But in this case, it was an open and shut case. And the chap who had committed the murder was apprehended and taken off to the jail. And the body was laid out, and by the time the court of inquest could be brought together, and they'd actually found enough people to actually come and bring the legal proceedings thing, they went into the room to look at the body, and it had gone. So, this is the first known use of the English law of corpus delicti, which means that basically there's no body, there's no murder. And recently, in recent years, common sense has prevailed, and that is no longer the case. And some of the poor police officers in Wiltshire, I think it was, or Gloucestershire, had to spend a great deal of time trying to find evidence to convict a chap who'd killed his wife, supposedly, but when there was no body. But yeah, that happened at the Bull. And the Bull itself had a poltergeist case and was fairly famously haunted back in the 1880s, 1890s. And pretty much everywhere around that part of Suffolk has got ghost stories, but most of them are really dull. They are coach, headless horseman, rattles through the village at midnight, tunnel at the other way, old smuggling type legends and all that stuff. There's a Lover's Lane at Badwell Ash, which I liked, because in the 60s a bunch of courting couples got caught out by their partners after running screaming to the police, because night after night in the Lover's Lane a burning red light would bob down the road and look in through the window of the cars where they were making out. And apparently it caused a bit of a scandal because nobody was aware how many people from Bury were driving out to this village lane. I suspect that it wasn't actually a ghost. I suspect it was either a local pervert who was inventing dogging, I believe they call it, or, alternatively, it was an angry husband looking for his wife. But it's all a bit Scooby-Doo, isn't it? There are some great ghost stories out there. There's some wonderful things that go on around Borley. Yeah.
Getting back to your moving coffins and the house that disappears, roughly in the same area.
Yeah.
Looking at geology as well as chalk, maybe something underneath. Do you reckon they could be related magnetically, or, you know?
In the 1990s, I made an episode of Ghost Hunters for Discovery Science called Spectres of the Seven, in which I put forward the hypothesis that seismic stress, tectonic stress along fault lines could in some way correlate to hauntings. And we actually found some evidence for it. Of course, the problem is that, unfortunately, faulting quite often occurs in valleys in the southwest. And people tend to live in valleys. If you look at Stroud, for example, it's a great example. Even in Bristol, population tends to avoid areas where you don't get faults because they tend to be either mountainous or bogs, as far as I can work out. But anyway, yeah, I'm not convinced that there's any evidence of that in Suffolk, because the actual ground is glacial moraine, boulder clay, right the way down to the escarpment that Borley lies on, where it becomes chalk. The chalk is very easy to tunnel through, and most of the stories around Bury St Edmunds involve tunnels, and a lot of the stories around Borley and around Suffolk generally involve tunnels and hidden passageways. I have wondered repeatedly if the 1970s crypt, the crypt under the church, the hidden crypt, could have been responsible for the sounds recorded during the Anglia TV broadcast. Because if somebody had entered the crypt, if it's well known and was still available to the ecclesiastical authorities, had closed it off as it would appear in the 20s, it's possible that the noises that are being heard in that broadcast are nothing more than somebody entering a crypt underneath and making noises simply to disturb the film crew above. I don't know.
I mean, the reason why I sort of asked that, I'm an ex-soldier.
Yeah.
Done many exercises on Salisbury Plain.
Yeah.
I have seen lights, not military lights or anything. I've seen lights, and that is all on chalk.
On chalk?
Salisbury Plain is got a lot of chalk on it. I've seen lights rise across the grass. I mean, you're talking probably 50 to 100 yards.
Yeah. Small balls of light.
Balls of light.
I've worked on earthquake lights for the last 20 years,
I mean,
so it's an area.
When you're on stag and you're in a trench and you've got nothing to do and nothing to see, I mean, you've got to be awake. I've seen it 2 or 3 times. And then you think it's like somebody creeping around with a flare or something, but these things just hover. I've seen orange ones, blue ones, slightly white, bluey thing, and they just disappear.
I remember John saying he used to see the blue ones in the churchyard at Stanton, where the moving coffins were, because they would rise up from the graves, but they were put down as being corpse candles, they call them in Suffolk.
These things they just appear.
Yeah, they
just 2 or 3 feet above the ground. They just whiff off.
If you approach them, they disappear, and they never move very high. No.
About 3-4 feet, and within about 5-6 seconds they're gone.
We saw one. It's me and Becky, Dr. Becky Smith, the parapsychologist, my girlfriend's at the back of the room. We took a bunch of people to the great churchyard in Bury St Edmunds 10 years ago or so, and as we walked through it, we suddenly saw these 2 lights that moved through the gravestones. And by the time we'd said, Becky, look over there, and she'd said, what, over there? And we said, no, over there. She never saw them. Yeah. They disappeared that quickly. But we all definitely, 3 or 4 of us definitely got a good look at them. I think partly also, if you're a soldier and you're used to being on night exercises, you know what's a distant car headlight, you know what's a shooting star. You absolutely are able to identify different things moving. One of my most tragic experiences ghost hunting near Borley was near Hartist. Rachel Martin, as she was then, she took me out with Darren one night because there was a wood there that's supposedly haunted by a maiden who killed herself after she got pregnant. So we went down to the meadow at the bottom of her garden, and we walked through in the darkness across towards the woods. And you can tell that I'm no soldier, because suddenly this thing went, whoa. And of course, I turned, squealed, and ran for my life, terrified. Darren followed after me, and Rachel said, "Why are you running away from a cow?"
Yeah.
Because I mean, you could just see its white, it was a Frisian cow, but it just had this white head looming out of the darkness that was going, ooh. And then there was another night, we were at Borley, and we were walking down the hedge on the road to Belchamp St Paul, which is where, if any of you know M.R. James, Count Magnus, read Count Magnus by M.R. James. I grew up adjacent to where he lived as a child. It's a fantastic story, but it's the ending of it. It happens at the crossroads at Belchamp St Paul, which is right by Borley. Anyway, we were walking down the road one night, and my mate Dave the Munchkins we called him, we were ghost hunting, but Dave turned around and he made a joke about the Met. And I can't remember what it was. It was a joke about, you know, entrance qualifications for the Met. And let's just say that it wasn't entirely... And then we heard voices laughing. And we're in a sunken lane with a hedge on either side. And, "What are you doing there, lads?" And the next moment, a WPC and a PC. Now, there's only like 5 police cars in Suffolk at night. I mean, you know, they're hardly over-policed. We're in the middle of nowhere, absolutely the middle of nowhere, walking down a sunken lane. There's not a car in sight. We're 5 miles from the nearest place, 2 miles from the nearest house. And Dave has managed to crack a joke about the police, about the Met, just as 2 coppers emerged from behind a hedge. So they said, "Where are you going?" And we said, "We're hunting ghosts." "Is it haunted round here?" "Yeah." "Well, we won't be sticking around then." "Well, why are you here?" "Police business." And we kind of looked at this young man and this young woman, and we looked at the grass stains, and we thought, they've either been on a really long-term surveillance in that hedge, or this is something we don't need to know about. So we said, "Thank you very much." And Dave said, "I'm really sorry about about my joke." And they said, "That's all right, we're not Met." And then they started telling us jokes about the Met. And that went on for about 5 or 6 minutes before they finally let us go. And they ignored the fact that Marcus was carrying a broken shotgun under his arm, and that Dave was carrying, I think, a stout cudgel, and that I was just wandering around with long hair, with like flowers painted on my jeans because I was a hippie man. And despite all of that, they paid no attention at all. Like, "Have a good night, lads. Bye." And off they went. And they jumped in their cruiser down the road and drove off. But to this day, I still wonder if there was something bizarrely supernatural about that. Anyway. Right, any more questions? How are we doing for time? Yeah, we're okay to keep going? Right, well, has any of you, I mean, locally, Bristol has got some fantastic stories. Do any of you know the story of the disappearing house of Dursley? Yeah? I think it's 18th century, isn't it, or 19th century. The idea is that there's a traveller who was coming down across, what's the common, Rodborough Common? Yeah, he's coming down Rodborough Common at night, down towards Dursley, or Stroud, actually, I think. Yeah, from Stroud, he's heading to Dursley. He's crossing over Rodborough Common, or somewhere around there, and he comes across an inn, and he goes into the inn, and it's a bitterly cold night, and he's exhausted, and he realises he's not going to make it. So he takes his horse in, and he ties it up, and he pays the money. And according to the normal version of the story, when he makes it to Dursley, he asks about the inn, and they say, there hasn't been an inn there for 50 years. But the other version you hear, which I think is probably the older one, is actually the fairy version, which is where he wakes up in the morning and he's lying on a brock, and there's coins laying next to him, and there's snow all around undisturbed, but his belly's full and he's warm, and he's had a good night's rest. But either way, there's the story of a disappearing house up there. And there's various other disappearing house stories around the UK, but they are generally fairly uncommon and fairly rare. So they're one of those things that, again, they actually should be properly investigated, but sometimes you have to be aware of the fact they are just folk sales. The bear at Rodborough, high up near Woodchester Mansion above Stroud, I had a peculiar, uncanny experience that one night. I'll tell this story then, last story for tonight. I was a young know-it-all. I was in my 30s, I think, and they brought out this new TV show called Most Haunted. Now, I'd never actually seen Most Haunted, but by an accident of history, I kind of got mixed up with some people who were eventually became involved with it. A guy called Phil, who used to wear a mesh top. He was a model, and he had a clipboard. Laptop engineer, Phil Wyman, great guy. We'd met at another event where I'd accidentally, it doesn't matter. A series of ridiculous events had led me to actually discover this show called Most Haunted. And it turned out that one of the producers was a woman who'd met me in TV land a few years before and had said, I like you, Chris. I'd love to make a show with you, but you've got a funny shaped head and walk like a duck. Well, yeah, deep sigh. Funny shaped head and walk like a duck. That's it. That's my TV career for you. So, when Most Haunted started, she'd better remain nameless, but she was highly placed in the business, shall we say. No, she wasn't on the show. She was on the technical side. She said, would you like to watch it? And I said, no, it sounds terrible. And she said, I'll send you a copy of the production masters. And I said, go on then. So she sent me a box of tapes. And you might think that being a ghost hunter, the first thing I would do is put those tapes in my little video recorder and watch them and get really excited. The problem was I didn't own a TV. So one night I asked my mate, Andy, could I come over to his house and I'd watch some. But by that time, my mate Phil had convinced me. He'd gone off to do a show called Scream Team. And he asked me, would I replace him as Chimera on the Most Haunted forum? Do any of you remember the old Most Haunted forum? Yeah. I was called CJ.23 on it. I was on the Most Haunted forum for years. And it was great. It was awesome. I learned more about ghosts there than I have in 20 years on the SPR or ASAP or any of that. The Most Haunted forum was a brilliant place to hang out. It had cool people. Anyway, I was on there. I replaced Phil, who was Chimera. So I was CJ, and Phil couldn't actually post because he was running around with a bunch of teenage lap dancers in a silver van. It really was. A girl called Amy. She was cute. Anyway, I didn't get that gig. I ended up doing the Most Haunted thing. So I used to type about this show night after night after night. I'd talk on the forum, but the thing was that the first 2 series happened and I'd never seen it. I never admitted that I'd never actually seen it, but I didn't own a TV. And then when I did actually manage to borrow a TV, it turned out you needed to have cable, and I hadn't got cable. So I never said I'd watched it. I just talked about ghosts because I like the people, and they were really nice. And then finally, as I said, the lady sent me, Jane, she sent me these tapes. So I went over to my friend's house and I put one on, and it was diabolical. I mean, it was bloody awful. I mean, it was embarrassing. It was cringeworthy. And I thought, wow. Like, just wow. And it would be that week that I suddenly got an offer from the TV production company. Would I turn up and do a show for them? And I said, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll come along and appear on your show. It sounds great. Woo, I'm going to look like an idiot. Oh, well, I'm an idiot anyway. What harm? So at the Bear at Rodborough one night, I was sitting there talking to my friends. And we were sitting at a table and people were enjoying their dinner. And there's this couple sitting next to me. I had no idea who they were, but they were obviously listening in to what we were saying. And we were talking about ghost hunting. And then somebody there said, so what's this show you're doing tomorrow, Chris? And I said, well, what's this show you've been asked to take part in? And I said, well, I've been asked to do some research for a show called Most Haunted. Have you ever seen it? Just once. It's got this woman called Yvette who blasphemes and screams all the time. She seems to be really annoying. And there's this guy called Carl who thinks he's a ninja or something. And I went on and I spent the next 10 solid minutes slagging off Carl and Yvette. At which point the people at the next table said, can we join you? And I said, please do. And I said, I'm Chris, and they said, oh, I'm Yvette, this is Carl. And I went, oh, nice to meet you. It's funny, we were just talking about people called that from this TV show called Most Haunted. Yeah, we heard you saying how awful it was, yeah. What would you do better? I don't know, why? Because that's us. Oh, and that was how I met Carl and Yvette. And to be fair, they never held it against me in the slightest. They were absolutely fine until they sacked me around about 2 series later. But that's neither here nor there. So they were great people and it was a good time. And actually, when I watch it now, I'm really nostalgic for those days and I wish that we could go back to it. And the last question, I suppose, for tonight then, as we must be running out of time by now, I always talk too long, is after Most Haunted, and 700 psychic research groups in the UK. What was a hobby for 50 or so ghost hunters and parapsychologists and eminent know-it-alls from the Society for Psychical Research like myself and other idiots has now become a massive thing that people are doing everywhere. We have democratised ghost hunting. We have let everyone do it, and I think we're better off for it. And nowadays, people all over the world are hunting ghosts. But we're not actually getting any evidence, are we? So far. Well, maybe we are. Some people, it depends what you regard as evidence. But night after night after night, people say, would you like to see my ghost photos? And the most convincing ones I see always have one thing in common. I get slapped after I say, I can see a face. That looks like an arm. Because it turns out they're actually an excited new parent's ultrasound scan. Because I cannot tell the difference between ultrasound scans, which are blurry and confusing, and so-called ghost pics. And so, I don't know where we're going. I don't know where we've been. We know what we're knowing, but we can't say what we've seen. That's talking heads. But anyway, but one day, perhaps, we will get somewhere on this subject. But it requires us to go out there and not take ourselves too seriously and actually experiment and try time and time again to find some real ghosts. So thank you for being so patient with my rambling.